chapter 13 is where we are. So did some mapping out today. We should, barring any major disaster, be able to finish the Kings, of course, by the end of the year. I think before then, but definitely by then. And then we're going to turn our attention to Daniel. And the reason we're going to turn our attention to Daniel is because the second half of the book has a lot of apocalyptic imagery in it, and Revelation plays a lot off of the subject matter of Daniel. And so we'll go there and we'll see kind of how we're doing with apocalyptic language, because it's, you've read Revelation before. It's a different world. It's a different vocabulary. And we're going to get to it at some point, but I want to make sure when we get there that we're ready to get it. And so we'll kind of see how we work through some of the apocalyptic language. And that study should probably take maybe 4 or 5 months. And then we'll, I about scared myself when I looked and saw somebody standing over my shoulder. But anyway, it's been a long day. And then we will turn our attention to Revelation and to spend some time looking at that. And it's my first time teaching it. There's a reason I've waited 15 years to teach it. And but I'm looking forward to it, and I think we can learn a lot of stuff. And really the biggest obstacle will be unlearning the stuff that we've heard our whole lives. And I don't mean that by necessarily even from pulpits in the church. I mean just in general, people's idea of Revelation and what it's really about are just two different worlds. So anyway, that's kind of the plan where we're going. And so let's pick up here and try and keep our pace so we can do that. All right, 2 Kings 13, beginning in verse 1. In the 23rd year of Joash, of course you remember Joash is the king who was saved by Jehoiada the priest, and then of course we read about him in chapters 11 and 12. So in the 23rd year of Joash, the son of Amaziah, king of Judah, Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, began to reign over Israel and Samaria, and he reigned for 17 years. So Jehoahaz reigns, the son of Jeroboam. You remember because of Jeroboam's obedience, chapter 10, verses 30 through 35, but mostly 30 and 31 if I remember correctly. God promises Jehu's, because of his obedience, he promises him 4 generations of sons to sit on the throne. And this is the longest succession of kings in the north that there will ever be. It's a little over 100 years of time. So he begins to reign over Israel, of course, the designation for the 10 northern tribes, in Samaria, which of course is their capital city. Verse 2, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and followed the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin, and he did not depart from them. Obviously, Jeroboam the son of Nebat refers back to 1 Kings 12 when the kingdom divides between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. He sets up calf worship at the end of 1 Kings chapter 12, and that kind of solidifies the break between the kingdoms and kind of closes out all chance of reconciliation. And of course, as we've said, the northern kings are all evaluated next to Jeroboam. And they all did. They all continued in the sins of Jeroboam. Some of them were worse, like Ahab and his family. They added Baal worship on top of calf worship. The kings in the south are evaluated upon David. He either followed the way of David or he did not follow the way of David. That's the method of evaluation. So in verse 3 it says, because of this idolatry, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them continually into the hand of Hazael, king of Syria, and into the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael. So he's talking about multiple over a pretty long period of time, because you got during Hazael's days, which we saw anointed in 2 Kings 8 as the king of Syria, and Ben-Hadad, who would be his son, his successor. And so they are causing problems. Then Jehoahaz sought the favor of the Lord, and the Lord listened to him, for he saw the oppression of Israel, how the king of Syria oppressed them. Now we're going to come into a couple of statements like this in this chapter, one much later in verse 23. But these statements are the ones where, so there was this old his name was Marcion. It's called the Marcionite heresy. He basically said that the God of the Old Testament, you have heard this before, but may not be familiar with Marcion, the guy who started it, that the God of the Old Testament is a different God than the God of the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament is a God of judgment and vengeance and anger and bloodshed, and the God of New Testament is a God of grace and love and mercy and compassion. The only problem is, the cross is a flat-out denial of that. It's an expression of God's love, mercy, and compassion, but it's also an expression of his anger and of his wrath, because Jesus is taking the anger and wrath that's directed to sinners. And so, but anyway, he went through and he dismissed all of the Old Testament and even dismissed great portions of the New Testament. But he kind of gave birth to the idea, at least his writings that we still possess, to this view of God in the Old Testament. And I've heard people say it my whole life. The only problem I have with it is that when I read the Old Testament, I just don't see that, okay? Even when God is going to punish them, it's almost as if God can't get it out of his mouth fast enough that he's going to punish them. It's like he can't finish that statement quick enough before he promises them that he's going to take care of them and be good to them regardless of what's coming upon them. And the tenderness with which God speaks. And so when he says here that the Lord listened to him, Jehoiahaz sought the favor of the Lord, which is quite peculiar. No king in the north really does that very much. But he turns to God, and God listens to him. Now, he doesn't turn away from his idolatry, but he does turn to God, and God is willing to listen to him. When he saw the oppression of Israel, these words are used to describe Egyptian bondage in Exodus 2, also used to describe the days of the judges in Judges 10. And so God is listening to him, even though they really have nothing to do with God. But he's still showing compassion to a group of people. I want to pause right there and go to this Old Testament prophet Hosea, or Hosea, depending upon how you choose to pronounce it. And I want us to look at chapter 11 for a second. Because Hosea is going to start prophesying and not very far from where we are in this chapter. But I want you to see what I'm talking about when you look at God and his promise of destruction, and then it's followed very closely with, it's kind of the idea of the old Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where he's like with a spider dangling you over the fires of hell, and it's taking great delight in that. A lot of people view God's dealings with people in the Old Testament a very similar way. That when he crushes people, he delights in crushing them. The only problem is that that's just opposite of everything the Old Testament actually says. Okay? Many places we could look, Exodus 34 being a primary one, when God reveals himself to Moses, the words he uses to describe himself are merciful, gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in mercy. That's how God describes himself. Okay? Now watch what he says here in chapter 11. This is to the 10 northern tribes, which is where we are looking at. And they have gone into idolatry. Of course, Hosea is forced to marry a lady of prostitution as a symbol of what Israel has done to God, and she has children. She has one child with Hosea. She has other children with other men. And Hosea, they kind of serve as an object lesson to what is happening in Israel. And so here's God speaking, chapter 11 and verse 1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son, talking about, of course, the Egyptian bondage and captivity. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. So God says, I delivered them, I called them to me, and they ran away from me. Yet, verse 3, it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. The image here of taking Ephraim by the arms and teaching them to walk is the same way we teach a child to walk, right? We're not the only ones to ever get the idea, hey, hold on to our fingers and we'll walk with you. when you're teaching them how to walk and they're learning that balance, God is saying, I'm that Father who held your hands. Okay? Then he goes on to say this, I led you with cords of kindness and with the bands of love, and I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws, and I bent down to them and fed them. So here he uses an illustration of an animal where some people would drive and hurt their animals. He said, no, I treated you with care. I drew you with cords of kindness and bands of love. I took the yoke off of your jaw. I eased the burden on your back. I got down on my knees and I fed you with my hand. It's tenderness. It's love. He says, they shall not return to the land of Egypt, but Assyria shall be their king. That is, they're going into captivity. Because they have refused to return to me. The sword shall rage against their cities, consume the bars of their gates, and devour them because of their own counsels. My people are bent on turning away from me, and though they call out to the Most High, he shall not raise them up at all. So people read it and they say, there you go. There's God executing his anger again. There he is being unrealistic or being judgmental. Well, wait a minute. He delivered them. He loved them. He taught them to walk. He got down on his hands and knees and fed them. And they ran away from him. And then he is forced to punish them because it's gone so far, it has to be punished. But then he finishes these words of judgment, and then listen to what he says now. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? And how can I hand you over, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart recoils within me, and my compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my burning anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim. For I am God and not a man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. Listen to what he's saying. He's sitting there, and there are not many passages in Old or New Testaments where God describes his heart and the inner workings of it in detail. For an example, in the New Testament, there's only one verse where Jesus talks about his heart, and that's in Matthew 11, 28 through 30. He's gentle and lowly in heart. This is one of the only times in the Old Testament where God pulls back that curtain and says, I'm going to let you see inside. And so here you have God who is looking at Ephraim and saying, how do I do this? These are my kids. I taught them to walk. I fed them out of my hand. How can I treat you like Admah and Zeboim, which were two of the cities destroyed alongside with Sodom and Gomorrah? How can I do this to you? My heart is churning within me. When God executes judgment, it's not something that he's delighting in. It's something that's got him torn up on the inside. Because that's not God's natural inclination toward us. Remember something. The Bible says that God is provoked to anger. But one thing God is never provoked to: love. Why? Because love is the natural disposition with which he interacts with us. To receive the anger of God, you have to provoke it. And when you read these prophets and you read these kings, look, if God were like you and me, we'd have killed these kings a long time ago and just started over. He's patient with them. You got a king who goes after other gods. We're going to see in just a second. He goes after the Asherim. He continues to worship idols. But he cries out to the Lord because his people are hurting, and God does what? He helps them. There is no difference between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. People who would say that just have never read the Old Testament. So we see some of those statements here in 2 Kings 13. We don't see a lot of them because that's not the nature of this particular book. It's not prophetic in its nature. It doesn't deal with all the inner workings. It's more of a historical flow of what's going on. And so back in 2 Kings 13:4, he sees their oppression and how the king of Syria oppressed them. And Hosea's contemporary Amos, in Amos chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, describes why God is bringing judgment on Syria. And it relates directly to this text, and it's because it says, Amos said, they threshed the people of Gilead with threshing instruments of iron. Now that could be taken two ways. One is that they literally killed them this way. It's possible. There may be something I'm missing there, but I don't really get that. I kind of get the idea of they threshed them. Threshing is kind of a symbol of God's judgment in prophetic literature, like harvest time. And but anyway, with the way they treated the people of Gilead, God is going to bring judgment upon them. And so he's moving in compassion toward them. And then you get this parenthetical statement in 5 and 6, and it says, therefore the Lord gave Israel a Savior, so that they escaped from the hand of the Syrians. The people of Israel lived in their homes as formerly. Nevertheless, they did not depart from the sins of the house of Jeroboam with which he made Israel to sin, but walked in them, and the Asherah also remained in Samaria. So here is God. He's doing all this, and what are they doing? Everything they've always done. God is more patient than every one of us combined on our best days. He is more patient than all of us combined on our best days. How many people would truly be patient when you help them? They've turned against you. You help them. And they don't even change. They just keep on going. That's who God is. Then it kind of shows how bad it got in verse 7, the conditions. For there were not left to Jehoahaz an army more than 50 horsemen and 10 chariots. 50 horsemen and 10 chariots, that's it. And 10,000 foot soldiers, footmen. For the king of Syria had destroyed them and made them like dust at threshing. He mowed them down. With nothing left. That's how desperate they are. With that kind of an army, you can't defend, you'd be lucky to defend a city, much less an entire nation. And God sees them in that desperation, and he helps them. Now, all the rest of the acts of Jehoahaz and all that he did and his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel, talking about historical documents that they possessed? So Jehoahaz slept with his fathers, and they buried him in Samaria, and Joash, his son, reigned in his place. So this is where it's going to get interesting. Verse 10, in the 37th year of Joash, king of Judah, Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, began to reign over Israel and Samaria, and he reigned 16 years. So we have two kings named Joash reigning simultaneously in different places. Okay? You've got Joash in the south from 2 Kings 11 and 12, and you've got Joash in the north. Okay? We're reading about northern kings currently. Jehoahaz, his son's name is Joash or Jehoash. They had multiple spellings. Quite a few people in the Old Testament had that. And so we've got two Joashes reigning simultaneously. But this here in verse 10 is Joash in Israel, or Jehoash. Okay? He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he didn't depart from all the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin, but walked in them. Now the rest of the acts of Joash and all that he did, and the might with which he fought against Amaziah king of Judah, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Joash slept with his fathers, and Jeroboam sat on his throne. And Joash was buried in Samaria with the kings of Israel. And so we don't really know much about the Joash of the north, but the fact that he continued down the same path in idolatry. And now you have what could be confusing again. You have a Jeroboam mentioned. Okay? So when you read verse 11, he didn't depart from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. And then it says, in verse 13, so Joash slept with his fathers, and Jeroboam sat on his throne, and Joash was buried in Samaria with the kings of Israel. So Jeroboam sits on his throne. But it's obviously not the same one. We're separated by over 100 years here, okay? So you've now got Jeroboam, and on the board I've got most historians, just to distinguish them so that you don't get them confused, we call the second guy Jeroboam the second, okay? He's not the same guy, obviously, as Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who lived a couple of generations before him. All right? Then we're introduced to this interlude. Sorry, I make my PowerPoints and sometimes I don't remember what I have in them. And so I was just trying to remember how I put this together. Okay. Verse 14. Now Elisha has been absent from the scene for chapters. All right, the last time we ran into him was it maybe 8? So he's been pretty absent, or 9. But now we read of his death and this peculiar incident that's really kind of hard to make heads or tails of. It says, now when Elisha had fallen sick with the illness of which he was to die, Joash, king of Israel. So this goes back to... So it can get confusing because it's start and stop, start and stop, start and stop. We just read an entire summary of Joash, king of Israel. Not to be confused with Joash, king of Judah. Okay? The thing to keep in mind about this is, okay, I love history because it makes sense. If you teach it correctly. As Americans, we teach history in a linear fashion. A to B to C to D, okay? We go 86, 87, 88, 89, 90. Jews care nothing about that. And so when you read their history, you have to... They're more concerned with telling this grand story, and they'll throw stories from different generations all together. And they're not necessarily concerned with chronology. And so we have to keep that in mind as we're looking at it. So the contents of what we're about to read fit in the time period of verses 10 through 13. Okay? Because you have Joash, who is king of Israel, when Elisha falls sick. And so he goes down to him and wept before him, crying, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. The same thing is what Elisha actually said to Elijah when he was taken up to heaven in chapter 2 and verse 12 of this same book. So what does he mean? My father is a term, or terms of honor. The repetition of it is he's placing emphasis on it. And then he says the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. So what does he mean? Chariots and horsemen are images of what? Okay. Chariots and horsemen in particular, pay attention back up to verse 7. For Israel, there was not left to Jehoahaz an army more than 50,000 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 footmen. Horses and chariots, those are military images. They're your protection. And so, when he cries before Elisha and says, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen, he viewed Elisha as the protector of Israel. And what we saw in the chapters previous to this, beginning in chapter 3 and forward, he helps Israel win a lot of battles. You see it in 3, 6, and 7, at least in those chapters where he's helping them win. Now here's the thing, this is the problem. When Joash says it, it's very different than when Elisha says it. Elisha said it in 2 Kings 2:12 about Elijah. Because Elijah was kind of that guy who stood in the midst and demanded that there be a restoration or a reformation in Israel. And so he was protecting them spiritually. When Joash says it, he's not, because of his idolatry, it seems as if what he's more worried about is the fact that if Elisha's dead, we don't win all these victories anymore. It's not the spiritual context. He's not a spiritual guy in the sense of following the God of Israel. So for him, it's more of like, I hate I'm losing the guy that can help us win some. Exactly. Exactly. Ross, for those who couldn't hear, he lost his foot in the door. Elisha was the guy that was connected to God. Even if you didn't agree with him, he was useful to you. So that also leads to a point, though, about evaluation. Sometimes our evaluation of people is far too low and it misses the point completely. Really, a lot of people look at people under broadly different headings. And the way some people view people is their usefulness to them. They don't even view them really as human beings. It's just usefulness. How useful are you to me? Can you help me get what I want? It's all about me still. And that's kind of the way Joash looks at Elisha here. Oh, you're the guy who helped us win a lot of battles. Yeah, but he was more than that. He was also the guy that would have saved your soul, who would have led you to God to have your soul saved if you would have just listened to him. He was more than that. And so the estimation that he has of him, I mean, I guess for him, it's a nice gesture, but it falls flat. He misses really who Elisha was. Elisha wasn't a warrior, he was a prophet. And so he misses the evaluation of it. So it says in verse 15 that Elisha said to him, take a bow and arrows. So he took a bow and arrows, and then he said to the king of Israel, draw the bow, and he drew it. And Elisha laid his hands on the king's hands. And he said, open the window eastward, which was the direction of Syria. And he opened it. Then Elisha said, shoot, and he shot. And he said, the Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Syria. For you shall fight against Syria in Aphek until you've made an end of them. Now, this is a little peculiar. They had different ways of interpreting events from their gods, but the usage of arrows was not uncommon. Ezekiel 21:21 speaks of the king of Babylon doing something similar. They would also, and you can even see this in like secular literature of the time, mythology, where they would open up a bird or an animal and read the entrails of the animal to decide what it is they should do. Should they go to war or not? Sounds foolish to us. Either way, when God is using it, it's certainly working. Okay, it's not the same thing as when people in idolatry use it. And so he shoots these arrows, and he says, that means you're going to have victory over at Aphek. Which is most likely a reference to 1 Kings 20:26, when Ahab had the chance to put Syria to an end, and he chose not to, and was condemned for it. And it says in 18, and he said, take the arrows, and he took them, and he said to the king of Israel, strike the ground with them. Now, I don't know if that means shoot them toward the ground, again, like just shoot them in the ground, or if he means literally pick the arrows up and just bang them against the ground. I don't know. I don't guess it really matters. Either way, it gets even stranger. It says, and he struck 3 times and stopped. And the man of God was angry with him and said, you should have struck 5 or 6 times. Then you would have struck down Syria until you had made an end of it. But now you will strike down Syria only 3 times. So, I mean, it's a little confusing, right? I mean, he didn't tell him how many times to strike. He just said strike the ground, and because he didn't do it with the fervor and the fury that he thought he should have, or 5 or 6 times, he doesn't get what he could have gotten. I think part of it is related to Ahab. I think 1 Kings 20 comes into the discussion here. That he just didn't have passion and fervor for the job that was in front of him. And so God limits him to his 3 strikes, which we'll see here in just a minute he gets. And so it's a peculiar change, but then it continues, exchange, but then it continues to get a little bit more peculiar. In verse 20, it says, "So Elisha died, and they buried him." Now, bands of Moabites used to invade the land in the spring of the year. They would go on raids. We saw this in 2 Kings 5 with the Syrians when Naaman the leper was healed from his leprosy. He led a raid, and that's how the servant girl wound up in his house who told him about Elisha. In verse 21, it says, "And as a man was being buried, behold, a marauding band was seen, and the man was thrown into the grave of Elisha. And as soon as the man touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet." I mean, I know what it says, but I can't really offer you any deep insight into it either. Yeah, well, so something like that. So they've got a guy who is dead, and they see the band coming, and they just have to dispose of the body quickly. And so you have two tombs. Some were built into a rock, and some were built beneath the ground. It seems like Elisha was in the ground. They just dropped him in there and got out of there, is what it seems like. It's comical in a way, and then all of a sudden he gets up. And then the part of me goes, and what did he do? Like, did he kill the Moabites or go back and get his friends for just no burial? Or the only explanation I heard that was even plausible, and it wasn't my favorite, but it was plausible, is that there's something about this that's symbolic, because some of the words that are used here and some of the language, and this goes into Hebrew, at which point I just kind of have to take somebody's word for it because I can't read it. These same words are used in Ezekiel 37 about the valley of dry bones and the people going into captivity, which was viewed as death to them, and being delivered out of captivity, like a resurrection, where you have the dry bones and the flesh comes upon them again. But that just seems like a strange way to communicate that to me. So anyway, any questions on those? I don't know the answer, so I don't really know that a question would matter. Never. So, like you would expect him to do something like maybe Samson kill all the Moabites or something, but he just, I don't know. So anyway, that's all I got. Okay, we'll pick up on at the end of the chapter next week and move into 14.